Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming today for the Meanings of Water. My name is Ruth Maher. I'm the program coordinator in the anthropology department. And together with the Anthropology Club Beyond Cultural Borders and the Campus Activities Services and Leadership Plan with Maribel Rodriguez, I think so. We've sort of organized this to go along with Civic Engagement Week. And just to bring you to something local, an issue about water, something that I guess we deal with every day, but we don't probably put much thought to it. So to get us started here, I'm just going to talk a little bit about water, and first what it means to me. Okay, I'm an archaeologist, so my concerns with water don't always flow with what everybody else thinks about with water. One thing that I think about with water is coastal erosion, sea level rise, climate change, and how that impacts cultural heritage. So that's one of my big issues that I always think to, look at and understand. And in that case, I've been working on a project of my own called Burning Libraries and coming out with a publication, because the idea that our libraries are being burned down, our histories are being burned down, our cultures being torn away by these big disasters and other things that happen. Okay. So to that end, these are things that I tend to think about, and these are archaeological sites located right at the edge of a coastline today. They weren't in the past, but they are now. So this is Skútustaður up in Iceland, a site that colleagues and I have been working on for quite a few years. And you can see how close the sea is and all that erosion face right on the edge. Okay, it's eating away at it. The site is being deteriorated. Big storms are ripping it away. So this is up in Iceland. We have another colleague of mine in Alaska who's dealing with the issue of permafrost. And we don't think about that too, but with the warming stages and the cooling stages going back and forth, what it ends up doing is destroying the archaeology that's there. And it starts breaking up because the crystallization that happens with the water starts spreading the soils away, and as the big storms happen or we start excavating, things are just breaking apart. So Jan here is working on a site that's 4,000 years old, but it's being destroyed, and she covers it up every year and tries to take good care of it, but it's disappearing because of what's happening. And then this is my site, my current site, in the Orkney Islands of Scotland. And here, what you're looking at, where the green grass is at the top going straight across, that's a part of the farm that hasn't been touched by the sea yet. Everything down towards the bottom of this is all under something called a storm beach. And this big site is listed on, was found underneath a storm beach where people said nothing is there. So this is another aspect of water where obviously they didn't build this. This is a Neolithic chamber tomb. It's almost 5,000 years old. They didn't build a tomb to bury their dead on a coastline, right on the shore. Okay, the sea was much further out at that time. So part of what I'm looking at in my own research and what I think about with water is these issues of what's happening with our water. But here today, a lot of what will be discussed is a bit closer to home. And it's what you may think about when you think of water, because I realize not everybody thinks of archaeology every day. I do get that. Okay, so this is about you and about your fellow students and scientists in your area and local people looking at water from a different angle than from what I normally see. And some facts about water. There is a finite amount of water, right? It's recycled all the time in that sense, right? Through evaporation, through rain, and it gets recirculated in a quick nutshell. Overall, the Earth has about 70% of water coverage, and that seems like we have lots and lots of water. Until you remember that 97% of that is going to be your salt water, something that you're not drinking and you're not dealing with on a regular basis. So only 3% of that is technically drinkable as fresh water, but 2% of that is tied up in all the glaciers that are currently melting now, so that's another issue for another day. And that leaves us with only about 1% of water, of the fresh water that's out there, and that's what we're using and we're thinking about every day. So when people consider it as this renewable resource, it technically is, until you start thinking about what we do to our water regularly. Okay. Now, agriculture takes up quite a bit. Worldwide, agricultural use of water is about 70% of all the water, that 1%. So that's a lot of it, tied up in, obviously, getting food. That's a good thing, right? And feeding getting water to our livestock, right? We think about in industrial nations, though, are using more than half of that water. Okay, so that's a lot now, just going to places like the United States or Belgium. And you also have to think about the amount of people in this world and how much it's increased over time. Okay, we need more fresh water today. Okay, our numbers are getting bigger. So it's part of the concern that we're talking about today. So this idea of overconsumption, though, it's renewable. I hear this all the time. I do. We have so much water. Can't we just go and melt glaciers? Can't we do this? Can't we do that? It's renewable. It's coming back. But think about where we use our water and what happens to it along the way. So some of the things to think about, just making a pair of jeans. Okay, I know jeans aren't worn the same amount as they were a little bit in the past there, but just to make a pairs of jeans, it takes about 500 gallons of water to make that one pair of jeans. If you think about the farming to get the cotton, right, making the dyes, the washing of it, the treatment of those jeans. That's a lot of wasted water just for that. On the other side of that, a hamburger, it takes about 630 gallons, with taking care of the animals, right? You think about putting tomatoes and lettuce on your burger, making the bread and all the other processes. It takes a lot of water just to make this one item. Okay. On a good note, a little bit less, it's only about 35 gallons of water for a cup of coffee for coffee addicts. And on the far end of that, nobody would be interested in it, about 20 gallons of water to make that pint of beer. Okay, so it does get lower for different purposes. But let's think about what this really means. Okay, it's not just about that, but think about the things that we drink and what we have today even with us, right? As a case study, a quick overview here, a case study in India. Back in March, Coca-Cola opened another plant. They have 58 altogether around India, or had. And they were drilling. They found a large aquifer under the ground. They were drilling into it. They put high-powered pumps into it. And suddenly, the individuals who lived around us in this village weren't able to get their water locally anymore. They'd have to travel 3 miles just to go get fresh water, okay, because the Coca-Cola company was taking a lot of it. What else happened, though, besides them having to travel far to go get their water? They found that, their yields decreased drastically, where they were able to, at one point, get 50 sacks of rice 1 year. 3 years later, they can only get 5 sacks of rice out of the same fields because the water wasn't there. Okay, that's a huge difference. Okay. Apparently, it takes about 9 liters of water just to make 1 liter bottle of Coke. Just the water itself. We're not talking about all the other processes that the other one talked about. Okay. And what Coca-Cola was doing at the time, or this plant, was capable of making 1.2 million bottles of Coke, Sprite, and Fanta every day from that plant. So you've got to multiply that by 9. Think about how much water was being used to create Coca-Cola and other products. And also think about just Coke has over 900 plants around the world doing this to the water. Okay. Where does that runoff go after they've processed it? Right, and they've done whatever they do, right? So they've used 9 liters to make a 1 liter bottle of Coke. What about the other 8 liters? We're not drinking it. Where does that go? Well, along with a lot of other companies out there, just like the jeans and the runoff and everything else, it goes back into the system, right? We talked about that cycle of life there with water. Okay, so it's going back into the system. And there's illegal dumping, there's other issues, there's just people, littering and throwing things in waters too. And that's part of it. This water is also part of our system. Our animals around us are eating this water, or drinking this water and eating the grasses that feed off the water. So it is part of the circle. So you can say you don't see it, but it's still there and around you. Now, the picture on the left is often what we think of when we say illegal dumping. What does it look like? And if you saw that anywhere, you would say that's disgusting. You wouldn't allow it today, right? You would fight that. But unfortunately, often it looks like the picture on the right, okay? Where you have a very pretty pond. Wouldn't you like to just jump in that or go fishing there? Right? It looks something that you might want to sit around one day reading a book, okay? Until you realize where it is. It's in Pompton Lakes, just down the road, okay? Place I grew up, actually, so I know a lot about what's going on in that town. And for years, the residents of Pompton Lakes have complained about DuPont, because DuPont was poisoning their waters, okay, and how they were treating their plant, their wells apparently, and then their facilities were leaking water into the leaking runoff and waste into the system, toxic waste. And they'd been complaining for years. They even got Aaron Brockovich involved at some point, if you know the whole Aaron Brockovich thing. And there have been tests. The EPA has gotten involved, and there have been tests, and they have come out showing that there's mercury and there's various other, apparently now lower-level carcinogens involved in it. But the water is underneath 450 homes. And these homes, there's plumes of vapors coming into their homes. They're finding it in the basement at different levels. And these are kids who weren't told about that for 20 years, 30 years, living in these areas. So how does that impact them and their lives? The lake that they are dredging recently was right behind my own house. They set up a dock there. They said it was clean. They threw some chlorine in it, and they said everybody can go swimming in that lake. So you think about all of the problems that are there. It looked good. It didn't look like anything was wrong. People fished there. People still fish there. Okay, so it does impact you, and that water is supposed to be your safe water. Okay? So let's continue on this a little bit. After a while, just talking to people and doing a lot of research on this, just two comments that I hear quite a bit when you hear about dumping and water. The first one here, I don't understand what the big deal is. We can filter any undesirable chemicals out of our water today, especially salts or fertilizers. Okay, and if we really need to, we can go melt down the ice caps. Okay, I'm going to get on that next boat and plane and everything else to get to the Antarctica to go get that. The ice caps are melting, by the way, too. Most of my work is up in Iceland, and I do see a huge difference there, too. So maybe that's not going to work out so well. And would you like to trust filtering out that water to drink with mercury, high levels of it, and some of the other chemicals that were found that they claim they don't have any long-term tests on to tell you whether or not it's dangerous in any way? So that's something that I'd rather have fresh, clean water than somebody who's, the water that's been treated as it comes out. Another one, again, was somebody behind me in a Walmart, as I was standing online telling me that the regulations are too strict and they should be all rolled back. We should get rid of those regulations keeping us safe with our water. Because again, we can just filter out all contaminants. So that's another issue that we do hear about. And the filtration system will get a lot of things out, but most of it's made for sewage and other cleaner water than the toxic stuff that is coming out of these companies. So it's not going to get out everything. Most of these aren't fit to filter out radioactive materials and toxins and mercury and heavy metals and other things. So what can you do? Just to bring a little, back to reality here, why did these regulations go in place to begin with, or be set in place? Well, in the 60s, Lake Erie, we know that one, right? One of the Great Lakes. It was considered the dead lake. Lake Erie is dead, they'd run around saying. Because all the fish in Lake Erie were dying all over the place. They're all washing up onto the shoreline. The pollution was so bad in there that there wasn't enough oxygen and healthy, fresh water for the fish to survive. Okay. Shortly after that, in the late 60s, a nearby lake that actually feeds into the area, Lake Cuyahoga, okay, the river, that caught fire. And I want you to just think about that. Picture that for a moment. Water catching fire. Something is wrong with that, right? And all these boats are out there trying to put out the fire on top of the water. It was that polluted. It had raw sewage. It had, garbage. It had chemicals Everybody was dumping into into this river. And finally, people put a stop to it. And the government put a stop to it. And they passed the Clean Water Act. Now, some of the things that will be brought up today and talked about, all of this will be, but some of the different agencies that are out there that are watching out for you, likely, you have the EPA. You also have the Department of Transportation. So when hazardous wastes are transported, right, they're watching out for that as well. And you have the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And these are three industries or agencies that are supposed to be watching out for our health and safety. They were put in place for that reason. And we can't deregulate. We can't take away all of these laws protecting us and regulations protecting us. We have a right to clean water. And that's what everybody will be talking about today. Okay, so thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoy the talk and the panel. We have some great people that are going to be telling you about some interesting things. I turn the floor over to Ms. Rae Cade at this moment.
Okay, thank you all for coming to our many meanings of water and why you should care event. I guess I should start by saying that a lot of people have asked me, how did this event come about and why water? So to answer the second question, it's because water is basically used for everything. We cook with it, we clean with it, we drink it, we bathe in it. But a lot of people don't know like the basic process of it and its cultural meanings. And to answer the first question, this event began last semester where we had a series of events. The first event, we had representatives from the Ramapough Lenape Nation, and they talked about the Pilgrim Pipeline and if it's constructed, how it would negatively impact our water supply. And in the second event, it pertained particularly to Paterson, New Jersey, and the quality of water in Paterson. So this event really spoke to me because I never really paid attention to water. When we visited the Passaic Valley Water Commission over the summer, they told us, look at your water quality report. In my head, I'm thinking, what's a water quality report? I never had it. So I went home and I asked my mom, are we getting a water quality report? She said, oh yeah, we have it. I said, where is it? And she said, oh, they're all in the attic somewhere. Well, that's helpful. So I went and I looked at it, and then a couple weeks later, our next water quality report actually came. So I started to look to see what is the water company that's treating our water, and I didn't find it. It was just, we're treating the water for lead and some radioactive materials. Okay, what else? So I did some digging around in Google, and I still didn't find anything. So then I asked my neighbors, do you know where our water is coming from? They said, oh, it's a municipality. And I said, what does that mean? They said, I don't know, Google it. So the point is, we have to be able to know where our water is coming from and don't take anything for granted. Don't be afraid to ask questions, pretty much. So that's what the Anthropology Club did. Over the summer, we continued our look into the quality of water in Paterson, New Jersey. We spoke with some representatives from the NJDEP. We visited the Passaic Valley Water Commission. We visited Suez, and we met with Jan Barry, who's also going to be one of our moderators, and he helped us out a lot by saying, these are some questions that you should be asking. These are like some pointers. And then we pretty much got a little bit hopeful, so we wanted to speak with the head of the EPA. That didn't go anywhere, but I thought, go big or go home. So that's what we wanted to share here with you today. We wanted to share some of the insight that we gained last semester and over the summer. And we looked at water differently, so that's what we were hoping that you all will do too. So with that, I want to introduce our panel members. We have Dr. Davi, who is a professor in the Environmental Science Department. Next, we have Dr. Karen Swanson, who used to work at the NJDEP, and she's also a professor at the Environmental Science Department. We also have Mr. David Sue, who is the executive director of Paterson Friends of the Great Falls. I wanted to make sure I got that correct. So that's David Sue. And then we also have Mr. Matt Smith, who is from the Food and Water Watch. And then we also have Owl here, who is a representative from the Ramapough Lenape Nation. And we also have Professor Tocco, who's a professor in the Anthro department. And we also have Jan Barry, who, like I said before, is going to be one of our moderators. So this event is from 12:30 to 3. We had our little lunch, and then after that, we're going to have our panel members come up and speak, and then we will have some organized questions, and then we will open the floor to our audience members if they have questions. So with that, Dr. Davi.
All right, hi everyone. Hi, I'm Nikki from the Environmental Science Department. Thank you for that introduction. It's very nice. I teach a class in hydro, so I think a lot about those things. But I was just going to give you my perspective on water. I'm a paleoclimate scientist. I study tree rings. So I think about water in much longer timescales from about 300 years ago to the past maybe 2,000 years. You can see a picture of tree rings up there. I spend a lot of time looking at those under a microscope and studying the width of those bands and the density of those bands to understand about past climate, drought, and moisture conditions. And that's a picture of my former student Rose coring trees out in the fields in High Point State Park. Those are Atlantic white cedars. So I'm just going to give you a little background about how I think about water. All right, so if you look at that picture right in the middle, it's a very old, gnarly, twisted tree. That one happens to be dead, but I spent a lot of time looking for old trees like this. This is from Mongolia in Central Asia. And trees like that can tell us quite a lot about what climate of the past was like. And if you look on the left, you see a map of the world. Those little red dots are some of our tree ring sites from around the world. These are the places we go to study climate. And there's a picture of what I would look like in the field. You can see I'm carrying quite a lot of stuff: sample, chainsaw, gasoline, field equipment, shotgun. You need all those things because I do a lot of work in the northern latitudes. But what we're trying to find is this graph. Apologies for showing you a graph right now, but I also think a lot about water on long-term scales. So you're looking, the bottom axis is time, that's 2,000 years, and that's stream flow that you're looking at on the x-axis. And I'm trying to understand how water varies through time, right? You can see a lot of variability in that curve, which I'm going to show you, talk a little bit about it again. But so tree rings add a lot of context to our understanding of water resources, right? And we look at climate, like I said, for hundreds to thousands of years. This is a picture of bristlecone pine. These are in the White Mountains in California. These are the oldest living organisms on Earth. They live to almost 5,000 years. They can tell us a tremendous amount about what environmental conditions were like for thousands of years, drought in particular. You hear quite a lot about drought in the US Southwest and California right now. Tree rings can tell us a lot about whether that is natural. Do we often see drought to that extreme, or is this some new phenomenon that we're dealing with? Tree rings can answer those questions. So you see a tree core at the bottom of this slide. We put exact calendar dates on those rings. Okay, and this is just an example of a typical site I would go to. This is also Mongolia, Central Asia. These are, oh, you can barely see that, apologize. It's very dark, but these are old Siberian larch trees growing on a lava flow. They're about 800 years old. And there's no soil buildup. They're growing pretty much on lava, so they're very sensitive to changes in moisture. So if it's a very dry growing season, it results in a very narrow ring. And if it's a very wet growing season, we get a very wide ring. Okay, and here is a great example of why tree rings are so important. I talked a little bit about the droughts that you hear about in California and the Southwest. But there's also a story about the Colorado River. In 1922, there was the Colorado River Compact, where they divvied up the water resources for the Colorado River between 7 states. And that's a map showing you the states and the Colorado River drainage basin. And if you look at this graph, you can see that green shaded area. They divvied up the river based on the data in that graph. So that's showing you 1900 to 2020 and stream flow, right? So they based the decision just on that data in the green shaded area, right? And then what happens after 1920? Can you see that the flow drops tremendously, right? And then if you look more recently in the gray shaded area, it's really dry and droughty. So it's a really good example of making decisions based on limited data, and in this case, making a bad decision, right? Because they made a decision how to divvy up the river based on really high flow of the river that wasn't actually representative of its natural variability, right? All right, so if we go back to that graph, this is stream flow of the Colorado River for 2,000 years. Just want to point out the 1920s. Maybe you can see it. But if you look at it in the context of 2,000 years, it was an extremely high flow period, right? Okay, and then the other thing you should notice is there's a lot of droughts in there, right? Can you see periods of a 50-year drought? Right, it's completely natural and within the range of natural climate variability to have drought for 50 years. And we wouldn't know that without tree rings, right? So the dark blue is showing you recorded data. And we don't have a lot of recorded data. We have maybe 50 years or 100 years at best of recorded precipitation or stream flow. So I do work to create much longer records of stream flow. So that's my perspective of water. Happy to talk more about that on the panel. Thank you.
Good afternoon. As Rae said, I'm Professor Swanson in the Environmental Science Department. I am a veteran of working at NJDEP. I'm also a veteran of having been an environmental consultant, and I'm very glad to be a professor these days. Rae asked me if I would talk about some of the laws that we have at the federal level and at the New Jersey level governing water and how it's being protected or trying to be protected. So I thought I'd start with a very pretty bucolic-looking stream because the first thing I want to talk about is the Clean Water Act of 1972, which, as Professor Maher said, was written and passed in response to some of the horrors that went on the Cuyahoga River. It was actually a reorganization and rewrite of the Federal Water Pollution Control Act of 1948, which had basically said, oh, we want to keep our water clean, but that was pretty much it. What they did in rewriting it was they gave a basic, solid structure to how we would regulate discharge of pollutants into, and this is an exact quote, the waters of the United States. The waters of the United States refers to surface water. It refers to navigable waters. So basically, any kind of stream, tiny to very large to the Mississippi, and any lakes or ponds that happen to have discharge to them. It also limits itself to what are called point sources. All right, that photo that we saw of the pipe with the water coming out of it would be a point source. Okay, things like that. It also established a structure for coming up with water quality standards, and it how to change those standards if the science changed over time. And probably most importantly, it created the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, NPDES for short. What this does is it is the tool, the instrument for regulating discharges. Anyone who's discharging pollutants into the waters of the U.S. has to have a NPDES permit. It has limits on the quality of water that you can discharge. It has limits on the amount of water that you can discharge in a 24-hour period. And it contains pretty rigorous, quite rigorous, monitoring and reporting requirements. Okay? There is, over the years, a list of compounds has been worked up. There are, I believe, 88 of them now on the list. And it is, each permit is individually tailored to the site and to the water body that's receiving the discharge. So a very clean stream will have much stricter concentration limits than one that we're in the early process of cleaning up. They're issued either by EPA directly, or in states where the state agency is designated, it would be issued by the state agency. In New Jersey, NJDEP does the issuing of NPDES permits. The other primary federal law is the Safe Drinking Water Act. And it was very interesting. When I was searching for an image of, a glass of water poured into, I used Google image search. And I had a very difficult time finding one that didn't show the water being poured out of a plastic bottle, which I thought was very interesting. It sort of took me aback a little bit. The Safe Drinking Water Act was passed in 1974, right on the heels of the Clean Water Act, and it is established, the only thing that it does is to protect the quality of drinking water in the United States. It does focus on actual water sources and also potential water sources, and this applies equally to surface waters and groundwaters. EPA is authorized under this to establish minimum standards to protect tap water. The treatment plants have to meet the standards as the water is leaving the plant, okay? And as we've all heard in the news over the last couple of years, there are any number of cases and places where the water, as it goes through the distribution system and through the pipes in people's homes, may pick up contaminants, all right? I don't know exactly how you would regulate that, what you do with it, except to replace the infrastructure, maybe. It is for public water systems, and a public water system is defined as one that has a minimum of 15 connections, 15 house connections to the system, and serves a minimum of 25 people, all right? It does not regulate private wells. So if you have a private well, the onus is on you to get that well sampled on a regular basis. I once turned down a very nice apartment because the water was supplied by a private well, and when I asked to see a copy of the most recent water quality analysis, the very nice woman who would have been my landlady said, "What's that?" Oh, never mind. I think I'll move on. These standards are health-based, and the standards that must be met are MCLs, maximum contaminant limits. They are the best we can do, all right? The goals are what we'd like to see in our water. So for example, for lead, lead's been in the news, the MCL for lead is, which is also an action level, is 15 parts per billion, okay? The goal, of course, is 0, all right? But the truth of the technology is that it's difficult to detect sometimes at the very low concentrations, and it's also sometimes very difficult to get things down to that level. We're do the best we can with the technology we have, and of course, always striving for better technology. In 1996, amendments were passed that required EPA to include detailed risk and cost assessments and use the best available peer-reviewed science to update or review or change the standards. As I said, there are primary standards, water regulations, that's 88 parameters. They are not considered to be a problem at the MCL, and public health goals are included in the calculations. The secondary standards, there are 15 of them. These are things that are not particularly dangerous to our health, but they may cause the water to be unpleasant, might give it a taste or a bit cloudy, aesthetic, cosmetic, or technical reasons. Okay, we don't think of that very often, but that is an issue. Okay. Again, compliance monitoring is mandated. The standard, in this case, it's not tailored to the company. The standards are the standards. You have to meet them. Failure to meet them may result in additional sampling, fines, or orders to cease and desist. Water plants have been shut down until they get the situation fixed. Right? And so forth. Okay. New Jersey. Okay. I'm not going to go through all of these. I listed them here, though. These are not all the New Jersey laws that pertain to water quality. But New Jersey has been very much at the forefront of the states acting to protect the quality of the water in the state, with good reason. We have a serious problem. It's an old industrial state, and there's a lot of contamination, and there's a lot of concern about it. We do have essentially the New Jersey version of the Clean Water Act and the New Jersey version of the Safe Drinking Water Act, along with many others. There are quite a few regulating things like if you live in an area where you don't have sewer connections, you have a septic system, it has to be built to very strict, stringent standards. Okay. The one thing that the New Jersey version of the New Jersey Water Pollution Control Act started, right? No, I didn't. Okay. Created was the New Jersey pollutant discharge elimination system. It is modeled on the federal one, but it is for groundwater. The federal law, the federal permits do not regulate discharges to groundwater. In a country this size, there's just too much variation. You can't do it. And so they left it to the states. And New Jersey actually was the first state to set up a program like this. Again, limits of the amount of discharge, concentration of discharge, monitoring, careful monitoring, and penalties and fines and so forth if you don't meet them. Okay. This was just some more of the laws. We have groundwater quality standards in place. We have surface water quality standards in place. And in many cases, the standards for the state of New Jersey are more rigorous than the federal standards. That's it. Thank you.
Hi, I'm David Sue. I'm from Paterson Friends of the Great Falls. I guess what brings me to you folks today is a originally historic preservation issue. In our National Landmark Historic District, which is a federal historic district, there's a reservoir called Levine Reservoir. It's been there since like 1885, relatively untouched. The national park is a boundary shared with the fence of the reservoir, so the national park's about 10 feet away from the water. And the Water Commission is subject to long-term 2 surface water treatment rule, which is an unfunded federal mandate to cover or retreat finished drinking water reservoirs. So covering in this case, they chose to drain the reservoir, cap it, and install 2 2.5 million gallon drinking water tanks. That doesn't mean the water is clean by any means. They have to treat it again after it leaves the tanks. And there are 3 open drinking water reservoirs in the Passaic County area: Levine in Paterson, New Street in Woodland Park, and Great Notch in Woodland Park. So these are assets in our community. They're assets for the historic district, particularly is where they've decided to start their project. And that's what drew me into it. When I get into one of these kinds of conflicts or fights, as they say, I try and become as educated about it as I can. Drinking water has a lot of regulations associated with it, and I tried to tune into all of that so that I could manage this situation in terms of advocating for preservation. What I've found is that there are a lot of things going on with our drinking water and a lot of things that we're not being told. I can go through these slides real quickly. They were more designed to familiarize you with the reservoir. So I actually brought a laser pointer. So this is the reservoir right here. This is the Paterson Great Falls. You can see they're really close to each other. There's Libby's Lunch, or there's Libby's Lunch right here. And I live right over in there. That's where I live. So this is another view of the reservoir. You can see Hinchliffe Stadium in the front, the waterfall here, and here's the drinking water reservoir. So what they're upset about is that it's open and it's subject to contamination. And the other thing is, by having an open air reservoir in their system, they can't mitigate lead in the drinking water, which they do by adding phosphates, which is detergent, and that's an anti-corrosive to the metals in the system, particularly lead and copper, and it reduces the contamination level from lead. Just touching on lead for a second, they have in their system 30,000 some odd lead service lines. So there's the main in the street, what they call a curb box that's got a valve in it, and then the service line that connects the curb box to your water meter. So in our community, 30,000+ of those are made of lead, which is lead contamination in the home. This is a short video of what the reservoir looks like. In Paterson, we don't have a lot of opportunities to be around these kinds of environments. And what you'd have here is 4.5 acres of detention basin with these gigantic water tanks. The next slide, I think, is a similar thing. And let's see what this next slide is. Okay, that's what the tanks would look like from the air. So they're 28 feet high and 160 feet in diameter, about a half an acre of coverage per tank. And the video you just saw was shot from here. These are detention basins, so there wouldn't actually be water in them all the time. And Route 80 is like right over here. That's a cross-section of the tank. It took me months to get this because they didn't want anybody to know what it would actually look like. They say they're going to screen it with trees and vegetation, but the trees have got to be so far away from the tanks that they can't fall on them. And how do you screen something that big? It just doesn't seem like it would be practical. And that's the area of the tank. So, all right. I hope you'll ask me a bunch of questions because that helps me, do more than just trying to spill it all out. I moved to Paterson in the early 90s and became involved with a historic preservation issue on a piece of property called the ATP site. That property was slated to become a housing development. After 8, 9, 10 years, we killed it, and now it's incorporated into the boundary of the national park. This is another fight. So what have I learned? Let's see. I've learned that your drinking water is not that clean. I've learned that there are 30,000 lead service lines. I've learned that the Water Commission tells people that they can mitigate the lead in their homes by running their tap for 2 minutes to flush out the water. And then I found a Center for Disease Control pamphlet that said that if you have a lead service line, you have to run your high volume tap, like a tub tap, for 6 to 8 minutes, and then run your drinking water tap, like your sink tap in your kitchen, for another 2 to 4 minutes. So they're not giving us correct information on how to be safe. The other thing that I'm dealing with is the issue of the tanks themselves. That's a solution that the Water Commission chose to implement to comply with LT2 and an administrative consent order from the DEP. So when a system's in violation, they do one of these ACOs, and then they have to meet a schedule and deadlines and such for complying with the administrative consent order. It's really esoteric in some ways, but they classify the types of systems and the amount of drinking water storage tanks they have to have. So this particular type of system we have in Passaic County would qualify for a 20% storage volume. That's a percentage of their average daily demand, which is 83 million gallons, so it's 16.6 million gallons. They're proposing to build 77 million gallons, which is not quite enough to support them for a day. The sticker price for 77 million gallons with the 5% creep a year rolls around $150 million. But their requirement is only to build a fifth of the 77 million gallons. So if you use just a thumb rule calculator on that, if you're building a fifth of the tanks, you should have a fifth of the cost. So instead of $150 million, it should be $30 million. I brought this up to the Passaic Valley Water Commission at one of their public meetings a week ago. They were not very happy about what I had to say. They said they were doing all this for the sake of public safety and what's in the best interest of the public. After the meeting, the director of the Water Commission, I don't want to characterize it negatively, but he had a fit at me. He's standing with his nose, right up against my nose, yelling and screaming and waving his hands in the air and talking about safety and public good and stuff like that. And, my answer to him was really, okay, maybe what you're doing is right, but the public should know that you're going to ask them for an extra $120 million and why. There are a lot of reasons why we should be concerned about our drinking water, and this little understanding has just sort of brought me to where I am now. I'm largely a community activist with regard to these preservation issues, and I hope you'll ask me some questions and find out a little bit more about it. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matt Smith, and I'm a senior organizer at Food and Water Watch. Food and Water Watch is an international nonprofit organization that works to ensure equitable access to clean drinking water and safe, healthy foods. So I've been at the organization 5 years. We have our office in New Brunswick, New Jersey, and it's a real pleasure to be here today to share some of our work and findings on the state of our drinking water infrastructure, the stuff that we rarely pay any attention to because we never see it. It's underground, but it has a huge impact on the quality of drinking water, the cost of the water, and who gets access to that clean water, and unfortunately, who doesn't. So the last few years have really been, the issue of drinking water has really been thrust into the headlines, particularly with the crisis in Flint, Michigan. I think that was the most notorious of them, where really the drive to profit off of water, the drive to commodify water by private water interests in the state of Michigan led the governor of Michigan at the time, who had taken over the city of Flint through an emergency management act, to switch from the Detroit River, which was a known clean water drinking source, to the Flint River, which had historically been polluted by a Ford Motor plant. So when that switch happened, it was driven by the fact that the Republican governor at the time in Michigan was trying to find ways to save money so he could give more tax cuts to the wealthy. So really, I think that we responded along with many community organizations and groups in Michigan to that crisis, to really try and make sure that not only relief and aid was being provided, but that we could really call foul on the politics that led to the Flint crisis. So I talked a little bit about our work, and really I'll just talk a little bit about some of the problems facing our water systems today and the solution that we're proposing to address those problems. I think, me personally, I was very inspired by the movement at Standing Rock that took hold. Really, hundreds of indigenous nations from all over the world, as well as millions of people, supported that movement. And even though the pipeline was eventually built, I think the message that carries with us that water is life and that it's worth standing up for and fighting for is extremely important, because it literally, we are water, and it impacts and makes up nearly everything that we do on this planet. So from Food and Water Watch's perspective, we do a lot of work on drinking water issues. We're working to ban fracking and fracking waste disposal, as they're definitely linked to water pollution. But on the infrastructure side, what we've seen is that federal funding to maintain the quality of our water pipes, our water treatment facilities, and other critical infrastructure that's supposed to be providing us with clean, affordable water, the funding for that has dropped 74% in real dollars since 1977. And so we're dealing with things like illness from contact with sewer overflows and growing knowledge of toxins in our drinking water, as a result of really the lack of any political will to invest in our water infrastructure. What this has also done is lead to the increasing unaffordability of drinking water. So instead of recognizing that we need to maintain these critical public services, we've put all the burden on individual ratepayers and cash-strapped municipalities who are dealing with this crumbling infrastructure, particularly here in New Jersey. Even though Flint grabbed a tremendous amount of headlines, here in New Jersey, we have a crisis with lead in our water as well, as Professor Sue had talked about some of the issues here locally. And really, because of the lack of federal funding, again, the onus to repair this infrastructure is falling to the individual ratepayers and residents who live in these areas, making drinking water nearly more unaffordable for a growing number of households in the U.S. So there's over 6 million lead service lines that deliver water to millions of people throughout the country, and roughly 11,200 community water systems have lead service lines, including schools. So the failure to replace the entire lead service line, including particularly the portion that goes from the main line to the homeowner's property, has led to these increased levels in water. I think just in the last 12 months, at least a handful of school districts throughout New Jersey have reported exceeding lead levels higher than the EPA drinking water standards. The problem with lead is that the damage is irreversible. Those most vulnerable are children and developing brains, and when they're exposed to lead at any level, it is unsafe, and it can lead to a whole host of lifelong public health impacts. So this is just another graph that declines the federal support for public water infrastructure, and really highlighting the fact that in order to really reach the minimum amount that the Environmental Protection Agency is recommending we should be spending to ensure clean water for all people, we would need to increase our federal spending 7 times fold. So I'm just going to rush till the end. This is directly related to jobs, because we can actually, not just by investing in water will we create drinking water for all, but we can actually provide jobs to working people who desperately need it. We're still struggling with unemployment after the financial crisis of 2012. And I talked about, in the Water Act. So this is the policy that Food and Water Watch has introduced federally. Representative John Conyers from Michigan has introduced it, and it would provide that $35 billion in dedicated funding annually to really address this crisis. And so you can text the word water for all to the number 69866. And that's just a very easy way to stay in the loop of what our grassroots organizing efforts look like in New Jersey around this issue. And then here's another list of ways, but there's also a Q&A, and I'll be around afterwards for anyone who wants to get involved. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Nenjusenzi Al Anashik. Anashik Kukana Ki. Anashik MB. Anashik Kishukin. Anashik Tindao. Anashik. My name is Al. I am a member of the Ramapough Lenape Nation. We are the descendants of the original people of Manhattan, and our home now is centered in the Ramapough Mountains in this region. And what I said was from the original language of this land in Muncie. We were once known as the grandfathers of this area, and Muncie, we were known as the warriors of the peaceful people, the Lenape people. In relearning our language, well, first I'll translate what I said. I said, thank you. And that's part of the prayers of indigenous people is to give thanks, to be aware of the good things we have right now. Among those being water. Water is one of the good things that we have that oftentimes we take for granted, that we cannot take for granted. So, MB is water. Kukanai Ki is Mother Earth. MB is water. Kishukin is wind. And Tindao is fire. And I remember having trouble finding a word for air and asked my teacher, we couldn't find it. But then when I looked for the word for wind, it was there. So that kind of reflects the indigenous point of view in that the earth itself is alive, it's active. I remember in my travels, I'm a human rights and environmental rights advocate. I met a woman named Roberta Blackgoat, who was a grandmother from the Dene people who were known otherwise as Navajo. And I highly recommend that you all see a short film called Vanishing Prayer. It talks about the continuing problems that they have, called Vanishing Prayer. But she said in a meeting that I was in that coal is the liver of the earth. And we talk about Mother Earth, and it's almost a cliche, but I thought it was a nice metaphor, but then when I started to research it, I found that when we talk about water being triple carbon filtered, that's coal. So coal does have certain properties like that. They went on to say in the Dene point of view, and I'm not doing it justice, but uranium, I believe they say, are like the brains of the earth. And of course, trees are like the lungs. Al Gore, in his movie An Inconvenient Truth, talked about the carbon cycle. And because most of the trees are in the northern hemisphere, you have a difference in cycle between the winter and the summertime. It is like the earth itself is actually breathing. So I'm here on behalf of Ramapough people my chief, Chief Dwayne Perry, who spoke here last year, he was guided by spirit to Standing Rock. He didn't plan on going out there, but when he saw youth, when he saw people even younger than you standing up for water and their rights, he said we had to get involved. So Ramapough, along with hundreds of other indigenous nations, we sent resolutions in support and people in support. And a phrase, a meditation for all of us that Matt Smith mentioned that came out of there is Mini Wachoni. Mini Wachoni is the Lakota, Dakota, and Dakota word for water is life. And I learned a lot from there. I found out from people like Matt Smith and others that that same oil that they want to put, and they are putting through the pipeline there, Standing Rock, they wanted to put through the Pilgrim pipeline to go from Albany, New York to Linden, New Jersey. It's already coming here in barges and trains. One of those trains blowing up, killing 47 people in Lake Megantic, Quebec. So it is the same fight. So Standing Rock is not over. It's still going on. It's going on here in New Jersey. So it's not just there, it's here as well. So I'm glad to see Mr. Berry and others here, because we have a community, Ringwood, that also shows how important water is and how important it is to life. And the chemicals leaching from there. And it's interesting because we like to think of it as people over there, but it's all of us that are potentially affected. They recently found a chemical called 1,4-dioxane leaching from one of the mines, and they're afraid that it's going to get to the Wanacree Reservoir, or it might be there already. People in Ringwood have been talking about this for decades. That reservoir is a water source for millions of people in New Jersey. So it's a very, it's not just their water, it's your water, it's our water. So I just wanted to end with a quote from Joe Shirley Jr., president of the Navajo Nation, whom I had the opportunity to travel with. And he said, "I was raised by my grandmother. What he said was, I was raised by my grandmother, and his grandmother told him that, hey, you know, you are one of the five-fingered earth-dwelling people called Homo sapiens. And he said that the monsters know no creed or color. The monster doesn't say that this is a white person, we're going to attack the white person and forget about the native person. It attacks everyone. It doesn't distinguish amongst people. And those monsters include greed, jealousy, bigotry, ignorance, apathy, and all sorts of diseases. And I would include processes like hydrofracking, dioxane. What I found to be interesting is that in this fight that we're in as Ramapough people, we started the Split Rock Sweetwater prayer site. And I highly recommend that you go to our Facebook site, which is Split Rock Sweetwater. And we're having a lot of problems with our neighbors. Our neighbors are rich people living in multi-million-dollar homes. And one time, one of the neighbors got really upset with me because he was accusing me of trespassing going through his backyard, which happens to be one of our ancient paths. So I thought to myself, you know, Mr. Sign, you shouldn't be as concerned about a Ramapough walking through your backyard as the trespass to your water. I mean, Wawa recently found out that there's 11 contaminants in their water, one of those being 1,4-dioxane. So I was thinking to myself, it's interesting how he focuses on me as an individual, but not the real threat to his water. So the meaning of water is really the meaning of you. As was mentioned, we are all water. We're all water beings. More than 60% of us is water. So the meaning of water is the meaning of you, the meaning of us. And why should you care? Because you are water. That's why you should care. So Mini Wachoni, water is life, Anishik. Thank you, Anishik.
Good afternoon. I'm Jack Tocco from the Anthropology Department. Thank you to the panelists for inviting me to speak. So in thinking about water and the anthropological perspective on water, my first thought was that, it's rather obvious that the need for regular access to relatively clean water is a human universal. But like all human universals, how that universal need is met and the ease of access to water and the social norms and meanings of water can be astonishingly varied. So, we know that water is important to humans. Human populations are densest near to oceans, to lakes and rivers, and generally very thin in places like deserts and other environments where fresh water is limited or restricted. We know there's archaeological evidence of travel on water and of hunting and fishing that goes back hundreds of thousands of years, and even of complex aqueduct and irrigation systems that go back for several thousands of years on multiple continents. So we humans use water not only, of course, to drink and to bathe, but also we eat and otherwise use and are blessed by the animal and plants that come from water. And although trains and automobiles and airplanes have diversified our means of transportation of goods over long distances, shipping remains a major means of moving goods in an ever more globalized world economy. I hail proudly from the Great Lakes state of Michigan, where shipping is still very much an important part of what goes on in our state. So in the contemporary United States, we certainly, most of us anyway, take for granted that immediate personal access to relatively inexpensive potable water at any temperature is something that we can have at almost any time. And in general, it seems that many Americans only think about water in the relatively rare instances where access to safe water is threatened in a very newsworthy way, such as the water crisis in Flint, or in my home city of Detroit, where municipal water shutoffs of those who are unable to pay for water has been a major kind of hot button political issue and really human rights crisis in recent years. I think we would do well, however, to remember that when we compare ourselves as present-day Americans to our fellow humans around the world today, the kind of unfettered and immediate access that we have to water, or that most of us have, is relatively rare. And also, if we take a longer historical view, it's rarer still to have this kind of amazing access that we have to water. Anthropologists have conducted research, ethnographic research, and other kinds of research on or among communities engaged in struggles over water pollution. Sometimes oftentimes these struggles have been against the activities of multinational corporations that have caused, that have threatened and polluted water because of their extraction of resources, valuable resources. So one example that came to mind is the work of the anthropologist Stuart Kirch, who has worked with people in Papua New Guinea in their struggles against environmental destruction of the Ok Tedi mine that the mining company BHP Billiton has exploited for decades, and also the work of anthropologists like Michael Watts, who has worked in the Niger Delta region of Nigeria, where Shell and many other multinational oil companies have kind of colluded with the Nigerian government and caused incredible environmental destruction, particularly to waterways in the Niger Delta. So I think that, despite interest in, I'm a medical anthropologist, and I think that despite interest in some of the sort of sexier global health crises like HIV and Ebola, we do well to keep in mind that waterborne illnesses remain among the top killers of people in many of the poorer countries in the world, most especially young children. And from a cost-benefit perspective, if you want to monetize things, addressing basic water sanitation needs could have an immense impact on averting illness and death around the world, but our attention as scholars and as public health practitioners, again, is often drawn to these kind of sexier or maybe newer issues that are, in fact, more costly to avert and treat than things like basic water sanitation. I just want to talk about one or two kind of personal cross-cultural encounters with water that really reshaped my own perspectives on water. One was living as a Peace Corps volunteer in my early 20s in a rural village in Niger, which is a country that is predominantly the Sahara Desert, very dry, and where people mostly live in the Sahel region and are overwhelmingly subsistence farmers who depend upon the rains to just have their basic existence. And when the rains don't come, there's widespread famine and food insecurity. What struck me so much about living there is that, first of all, the water came out of a well that was more than 60 meters deep. It was pulled by hand out of that well, almost exclusively by women who generally had babies strapped on their back as they were doing this work. That when I lived there, I would exist or subsist off of usually one or two, I don't even know what the volume of water is, but a container about this large of water, and bathe with about 3 cups of water to take an entire bath. And even still, my water consumption was greater than those of local people who had been living there for so long. The other thing that's so striking about Niger is that because of climate change and because of the warming of the globe, there are major effects on people's lives, on, again, people's ability to subsist off of, subsistence agriculture in a very environmentally difficult place to live, so that, even the effects of climate change that people there might have very little impact on are very impactful upon their own lives. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, so our question is, or our first question is, actually 2. Do you think New Jersey is doing enough to protect our water, and how would you improve our current water laws in New Jersey? Anyone?
I mean, I could take a shot, and then if anyone wants to fill in. I mean, what we saw under the last administration was a rollback of a lot of the basic common sense policies to protect clean water, basic setbacks from wetlands and rivers, and protections for drinking water rivers. So immediately with the new governor as of last night, well, isn't sworn in until January, but we have an opportunity to reinstate those protections to ensure that our drinking water sources are protected. The other major threat to drinking water in this state is the proliferation of pipelines due to the fracking boom. And so I think the next governor would do well to implement a moratorium or a ban on any new fossil fuel development, not just because of the localized pollution from a pipeline spill into a river, but because by continuing to put more and more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, we're going to alter the water cycle beyond any point that would be sustainable for human civilization.
I'd also like to say, I think we have good laws, but one of the problems since over the last 12, 15 years is that because of financial considerations, various governors have allowed the number of people who work at DEP to decline. People would retire and not be replaced. And I think the first thing that we need is more compliance people, the Department of Enforcement, really, the Enforcement Division, to get out there and make sure that these laws are being enforced properly, and that people are complying with their permits and doing what they need to do. Because I think it's pretty clear that there's a lot of stuff sliding through, simply because there aren't enough people at the agency to really do the job that they're supposed to be doing.
I think it's going to take a lot of public mobilization, opinion, which is one of the reasons why this is such a good talk to have. I remember being in Pompton Lakes, and they had a pump and treat system where they're trying to bring the water up, purify it, then bring it down. I thought to myself about the metaphor of Mother Earth. And I said, well, my goodness, because my mentor explained it to me. This is dialysis for the earth, in a sense. And I just find it fascinating that, and this is probably a gross underestimate, but the 45th president wants to cut the EPA, which has, a $10 billion budget. We spent $25 billion in Afghanistan alone last year. So some of it, I think, is a lack of political will, which means that we have to have public opinion to put pressure on people, where we spent trillions of dollars on these wars in the Middle East, but now they're telling us we can't find money to fix our infrastructure for our water. I mean, we have the money. We just don't have the will. We need to get that kind of will.
The Pilgrim Pipeline comes through this area. I'm personally not exactly sure where it comes through this part of Passaic County, but who would like to talk a little bit about what that is and what it could potentially do to the water in our area of northern New Jersey if it were to be constructed?
So the Pilgrim Pipeline, which Al mentioned before, goes through sacred Ramapough land in the Ramapough Mountains, or would go. So it's a proposal now. It's not actually built, but it's been a proposal for the last 4 years. We've put up a lot of opposition, primarily because of the threat to drinking water. Just in New Jersey alone, it crosses over 3 major drinking water rivers, including the Passaic River. It crosses over the Ramapough Aquifer and Ramapough River, which feeds into the Wanacue Reservoir. And so Wayne, actually, the township of Wayne and some of the surrounding areas pull a lot of their water from the reservoirs up in the protected highlands region, as well as from the Ramapough Aquifer. So we're talking about the cumulative drinking water supply for millions of people in northern New Jersey who would be threatened by it. So even though the pipeline itself is further west of here, it would come down, it would cross into New York, or from New York into New Jersey along the ridge of the Ramapough Mountains before it would run along the Route 287 corridor down western New Jersey.
Again, this is one of the reasons why Standing Rock is so important, because it really illuminates a lot of things that we may not have normally thought about. One of those is that all pipelines leak. All pipelines leak or will leak. And I believe it was maybe Kalamazoo, Michigan, there was some spill there where you had a whistleblower who exposed this, that all pipelines will leak. So my chief Dwayne Perry, he brings up the example of a 55-gallon drum spilling into one of the aquifers could contaminate it for again, the water source for millions of people. One of the reasons why the Ramapough Pass is a flashpoint is that it's one of the doors to the continent. It's a gateway over the mountains. So all of the major infrastructure, or a lot of the major infrastructure, goes through the Ramapough Pass. I mean, it's no coincidence that the thruway is there, transmission lines, pipelines. My grandfather's buried in the grounds up there, and there was a pipeline even decades ago that went there where they disturbed remains, and so we're very disturbed by that, just not only for our sacred sites, but for our current health and safety and welfare. So again, this is not just a fight for Ramapough. I mean, we have the Wanacue Reservoir, and we have drinking source for millions of people in New Jersey. So the Pilgrim Pipeline, and again, it's important to keep in mind that the Bakken crude oil, which is produced by hydrofracking, it's going to this region right now in barges and trains. Pipeline is another element to that, but yeah, I mean, the issue of fight over pipelines is far from over. I mean, I think I learned from Matt Smith Water Watch that we've fracked about a third of Pennsylvania. 2/3 is left that could be fracked. So this is a very ongoing hot issue, but if it's any kind of indication of a path forward, the Pilgrim Pipeline has not been built yet, and with the support of people in the community and others, maybe never.
So I believe this question is directed to Dr. Davi, but anyone else can answer too. So is there a difference in water quality between a few centuries ago until now? And if there is, what are the major differences?
Surely it is different. My research, I don't look at water quality of the past. And I don't know if people looking at some type of historic samples more than, decades ago or of water quality, but water quality was quite bad if you think about places like the Hudson River that were considered just industrial rivers and completely blacked out on maps. They've bounced back quite a bit there. I mean, they still have a long way to go, but they're in better condition than they were, say, in the 1960s and 70s before all this laws went into place.
And I just wanted to add that, the seminal moment in our country's history around environmental protections, the passage of the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, this didn't just, fall from the good intentions of, our elected officials. Those landmark laws were passed specifically because millions of people took to the streets to demand action from their government to protect their water and clean up their environment. Around the same time, it was the first Earth Day ever. Earth Day has become so corporatized now that we forget that it's as radical origins, as radical roots. It started with people taking to the streets to say enough is enough. You can't poison our communities any longer. Millions of people took action on that single day, and that sustained movement really led to the fact that it forced the Republican president at the time, President Nixon, to implement those laws. So I think it just really informs my view around social change, which is, we should really feel empowered. If we look at all of the great progressive change in our country and much of world history, oftentimes it happens when people are getting together, feeling empowered, making plans, not waiting for experts to tell them, and taking action on the issues that matter to them.
Thank you, Matt. I went to the first Earth Day in New York City in 1970. Who knew? So many things happened as a result of those activities under a Republican president, which is lost sight of. However, since that time, we have another Republican president, and this is a question that probably Dr. Swanson wants to address. Current president signed an executive order to roll back the clean water rule. This was in February. What would this do in our area of northern New Jersey?
It probably would not actually be quite as bad as it sounds because we have such strong state laws, which are already more stringent and have more stringent requirements than the federal ones. So it gives us a bit of breathing space. The danger would be if it's done and it becomes, people get used to it, and then perhaps at the state level they might start say, well, maybe we don't need all these, we don't need as much protection because look how much better it is. I think one of the things that concerns me is that it's been a long time since the 70s, and we have a whole generation that has been born and grown up with clean air and clean water, and the assumption that it's just going to be there. And I think those of us who are old enough to remember the first Earth Day, I'm a little concerned about that because I'm afraid that people will just assume that it will continue to be that way, and some of these protections may sort of be eroded, in sight of, well, it's bad for jobs or something like that. And so I think it's very encouraging to see people like Matt who are vigilant and are keeping their eye on this and continuing to educate people, because I think that's really what we need to keep our eye on and keep doing.
Thank you.
We can get rid of the Clean Water Act. We cannot get rid of our need for clean water. I think that's a fundamental disconnect in our system. I mean, Donald Trump and Scott Pruitt's greatest enemies aren't environmentalists. It's the environment, and they lose once they even try to do something like that. But in some ways, I think what they're doing is, and I think the Buddhists have a saying that your enemies or your opponents are your best friends because they force you to transcend yourself. So what's really happening is it really is making stark choices for us as a society going forward. So, regarding the Clean Water Act, I mean, the Cheney rule, you had the Halliburton loophole in which they actually carved out exemption from the Clean Water Act for hydrofracking, one of the most disastrous types of technology. And that kind of went under the radar screen. So in some ways, what's being done now is more extreme and overt, but we had loopholes and dismantling regulations even before that. Sometimes when I hear Dick Cheney criticizing the current administration, to me that's almost like Darth Vader criticizing Voldemort. Like, hey man, you're too violent.
And the only other thing I would say is that we have to push back on this argument that somehow we're sacrificing jobs to protect our environment. If we actually look at the numbers, environmental protections create jobs. So, you know, really the issue is not around job creation, it's about wealth extraction for a tiny wealthy elite who are screwing over the rest of us. By poisoning our communities and polluting our water, and myriad other ways of social and economic injustice. So really, environmentalism really is a class issue, it's a race issue. It cannot be separated from these other critical issues of our time. So I think when we start to connect those dots, we really expose that the emperor does not have any clothes, and that we are on the side of justice.
May I comment?
I think the bottom line when dealing with these kinds of, I'll call them fights, activism, is you have to put the company in a position where it's going to be a loser for them to do what you don't want them to do. So you can do that to a certain extent with regulation. You can do that with a public voice and a strong community. And you can cost them money or give them an incentive to do it a different way. Right? Because ultimately they're taking the path of least resistance. They're putting a pipeline through your backyard because that's the way they make more money. They wouldn't do it if that wasn't the case. Right? So you can write laws to tax their pipeline. You can zone in your community to prevent that type of pipeline from coming through. In New Jersey, I think we're one of a dozen states where you can have an initiative of voters, where you can have the community craft its own ordinances. You know, you just do a petition, you get enough signatures, it goes before the town council, they either adopt it or it goes for referendum. Once it goes for referendum, it's stuck on the books for at least a couple years. We saw public questions yesterday. You know, we can raise public questions by petition in this state. And we can just knock them out of the park and just say, you can't do it anymore. And it's over. And we don't have to wait for our legislators to do it for us. We can do it ourselves. So the fight is cost them money, use the existing laws in order to thwart their efforts and frustrate them or make them do it a different way, and change the laws as you see that you need them, and take initiative and be persistent. Thank you.
So this question is also for David too. So as part of an effort to combat piles of water bottles cluttering sites like the Grand Canyon, the National Park Service issued rules in 2011 that let parks ban the sale of bottled water, a policy that didn't include bottled sweetened drinks. In your opinion, why weren't these included?
I think that a lot of rules and laws are crafted by people who aren't thinking about the whole picture or are not really as well informed as we'd like them to be. It's an error. There's a difference between an error and a mistake, in my opinion. So they made an error. We need to go back and fix it. It's as simple as that. We just don't spend our time affixing blame or being angry. You just go back and say, well, it didn't address the issue, work the problem. And I know that's not necessarily a direct answer to your question, why it didn't happen. But like, I'm struggling now with these water tanks. If the tanks were within the boundary of the national park, they just couldn't do it. The regulation wouldn't allow it. And I found out from one of the people that helped write the national park legislation that they left it to like an intern to draw the map of the national park boundary. So some person who just didn't know one way or the other drew some lines on a piece of paper. And we struggle with that today. So it's the way our laws are crafted, but you can go and recraft them, change it.
I mean, I have a slightly more cynical view. I think that really who writes laws in this country are lobbyists for the massive corporations who control our democracy right now. And so we need to eliminate corporate influence from our politics. It starts by getting money out of politics. Since the Citizens United decision, I mean, it was already bad, and now we have billions more dark money that we can't trace, we don't know who it's from, and it's unlimited amounts of money from the wealthiest individuals who are influencing every outcome of from our elections to our public policy at all levels of government. We run into this every day, but you're right. We have tools and we have levers of power to fight back. Just last night in Pennsylvania, there's a massive pipeline that's being built to take the gas liquids that are being fracked from Pennsylvania to Philadelphia to export them. The state of Pennsylvania is in bed with the oil and gas industry. They approved the pipeline. The federal government approved the pipeline. 2 local towns along the path of the project, grassroots groups ran candidates, and we actually, Food and Water Watch, supported those candidates who pledged to uphold the existing zoning laws to block the pipeline from going through their towns. And those candidates who were Democrats won in towns that haven't voted Democrat in decades, maybe ever. But it's because the pipeline impacted people and cut beyond the political rhetoric and the partisan divide that usually keeps us separated. So I think that we have tools at our disposal, but we have to keep our eyes on the ball and know that there is extreme corporate control. Princeton University did a study 2 years ago that finds that we no longer function as a democracy. We function closer to an oligarchy because the consensus around what the people want in terms of laws is not being addressed or passed. The consensus of what the powerful corporations is being addressed and passed. And so that's the critical, the radical or root problem that we need to uphold or uproot. And that's the answer to that is all of us getting involved in whatever ways that we can, bring our unique talents, skills, and passions in whatever capacity we can, even if it's an hour a week or an hour or 2 hours a month, getting involved with some kind of community or local organization that fits with your values and being a part of the political process.
Given the fact that there's lead in the water in so many places, what choice do people have to drinking bottled water?
Well, there's ways you can. In my home, I put in additional filtration that addresses the lead in the water. Because I can't control the rest of the system. I'm a tenant. And in apartment buildings, the water languishes in the lines for extended periods of time and picks up lead from connecting Solder and from valves and things like that, even if you change the service line, which needs to be done. But that took some money. It took $150, $200 and my ability to install it. And not everybody has that resource. But we can put pressure on our elected officials to address service lines. There is, through the New Jersey Environmental Infrastructure Trust, there's about $1 million sitting there waiting to be spent on remediating service lines in communities. Now, the big problem is a service line is really the property owner's problem. you know? And the water company, the water commission in our community here, Passaic Valley Water Commission, is not going to just spend all this money. We have to create a way for that to be done. Now, and what I'm dealing with now is this long-term 2 rule for cryptosporidium bacteria. So that's why they have to treat and cover the reservoirs. You could just as easily do that for lead service lines, and you could make the government come up with the money to say this is a public health crisis. You know, lead problems in Paterson are worse than Flint. You know, we don't have the anti-corrosives in the system, and even if we did, it's not a solution, it's a Band-Aid. So it's kind of circling back. It's what I call being persuasive, not convincing. I don't think convincing really works. I think you convince as many people as want to hear it, and then after that, you have to persuade them. And persuasion doesn't mean you get them to see it your way. You just don't give them any other choice. And you do that through political pressure, through the press, through whatever legal means are at your disposal. You know, and you can make it really tough, but it takes a long time. It takes thousands and thousands of hours of time researching and pressuring and grinding and going to meetings and making it all known that you want this change. And if you aren't willing to make more effort, they're just going to step on you. And that's all there is to it. You can stop it, but you have to be willing to make that effort. And I think that's our gap in this country right now, is people making the effort and knowing what effort they need to make. Thank you.
If I may, I think that it's also partly an issue of public perception. You know, we've heard a lot last 8-9 years about the infrastructure in the United States and how we really need to get on it. And you know, a couple bridges collapsed, and people are going, "Oh my gosh, we have to do it." And what no one ever talks about is the part of it, the water lines. That's part of the infrastructure too. And so if we're going to rebuild our nation's infrastructure, which we should, we need to be vocal about saying, well, don't forget this part of it. Rebuild this at the same time, and maybe rebuild this first because it's so critically important. I also recently put in a filtration system in my home too. Mm-hmm. Just my home is newer. It was built in '95, so it should be okay, but I didn't want to take chances. You know, it's just when it comes down to something like that. But I think we do need to be more vocal about the fact that this is part of the national, you know, skeleton, if you will, and it's one of the parts that we really need to focus on.
And don't underestimate the power of your vote. You know, I've seen elections flop on 8 votes. You know, so if you live in an apartment building, I ran a tenant association for like 144 units, and they accommodated. I never even realized it when I started doing it, but there's hundreds of votes there, and they're scared of it. Politicians are scared of that voting power. So you can make a voters association in your town, you know, in your community. You get a block of 50 or 100 people together, they're going to pay attention to that because they need those votes, and it means something.
And just to piggyback on what Professor Soy said, I would just add that I think 99% of the work is the research and education and legal advocacy and elections and community organizing, but there does come a time, as we've seen in our country with the civil rights movement, where you've exhausted all of those options, you've done all of your due diligence, and you're still not getting justice. And so I wouldn't limit put all of our marbles in the legal basket, especially when the laws are so designed and written by the same corporations who are exploiting us. So there does come a time when civil disobedience is appropriate and right in the face of extreme injustice and no other ability to get justice.
So this question is for Professor Tocco. Is the convenience of buying a water bottle and tossing it still ingrained in our culture?
I think for most of us, yes. I mean, recycling has maybe made inroads in people's perceptions of recycling as the thing to do, which of course itself is a step better than throwing a bottle in a landmine, but still a process of waste. I think so. How many vending machines are there here on this very campus that sell bottled water and that sit next to a water fountain that gets used very infrequently? So I do think that there's that attitude, and still a lot of maybe perception that municipal water is unsafe to drink, regardless of the fact that it may be perfectly safe to drink or little different than the bottled water than one would spend money on. So I think that there is a sort of a cultural ethos of one-off purchases of water when we could probably be doing things quite differently.
I'm going to follow that question up, and everyone could speak to that from experience. Is it done differently in other parts of the world?
In Maine, they make you put down a deposit on your bottles. I'm not sure if it applies to plastic bottles. I think it does. I'm not sure, but, that's one way to deal with it. We don't have deposit in New Jersey for bottles. Make the deposit amount high enough and people are going to bring their bottles back. Give them an economic incentive. And if they don't, then you take that money, that deposit money, and you spend it on your water infrastructure. Seems like a simple solution, right? They take gasoline tax and they use it on roads. So why not have a water deposit system and make it pay for our infrastructure? I think it makes sense. We struggle in Paterson, and the mean income for a family of four is $33,000. It's really low for four people. So people are living on that kind of money, don't have a lot of extra financial resources available to them. So I think a lot of us have more privilege than that. And we need to be able to use our voices in the capacity that we can. But a deposit system, I think it would be great in New Jersey. I think it would be great. Make them charge 50 cents for a bottle in deposit. I bet you people would bring them back.
Many places actually used to have that. I grew up in, I didn't grow up in New Jersey, I grew up in Connecticut. And when I was a kid, bottles and cans, there was like it was about a nickel, I think. And when I would go to the grocery store with my mom, and we'd take them with us. And, for a six pack of little Coke bottles, it was 30 cents, and that money became mine. So I was very motivated to make sure that we brought them back and all. And it has worked in the past. I think California had reinstated it. But I think one of the things that happened is when a lot of bottling companies switched from glass to plastic, they stopped doing that because they didn't see any need to recycle the plastic. And of course, now we know we really, really need to recycle the plastic. But they've worked in the past. I don't see why they wouldn't work again.
Yeah. I was in Amherst, Massachusetts 2 weeks ago. I went to the local CVS to buy something. They don't have plastic bags in that town. They just made them illegal. Can't use them. Can't have them in the store. They're just not there. And then they charge you money. Oh, when I went to Portland, Maine, they charge you money for paper bags. So if you don't want to pay the 25 cents or whatever it is for each paper bag, you better bring your own bag.
I think that's the bigger problem, right? Is not, yes, we need to shift our culture, and there's absolutely work to be done, but we have to look at the root cause of the problem. We have a proliferation of cheap throwaway plastics on this planet because the fossil fuel industry, the chemical industry is allowed to produce them by using our air, our atmosphere, our water as their dumpster, as their sewer for free. So we shouldn't allow them to do that. And if we constantly reduce ourselves to consumers, we're playing into their hands because that's how they want us to behave as consumers who only have a choice between choice A and choice B. GMO Cheerios versus GMO, Cheerios aren't GMO anymore, but GMO Frosted Flakes or GMO, something else. It's the illusion of choice. When actually, if we look deeper, there are systemic problems that can help us facilitate the transition away from this throwaway culture to something that's more sustainable.
Okay. Thank you for the panel questions. That's all the time we have for the organized questions. Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, that's all the time that we have. But thank you so much, everyone that came, and thank you to the audience.